I think the context in which you become a follower of Jesus shapes the cost and the benefits and the opportunities and the struggles you face. I think that's clearly the case, and maybe in some ways, we have a greater freedom here, or which can help us on our journey, but it can also perhaps make us blind to some of the real challenges of discipleship. And I think you're right. But it's interesting that Jesus talks about the cost of building a tower. He also talks about the wise man built his house upon a rock rather than building on sand. I should imagine, I'm not a builder, but I should imagine building on sand, it's quite tempting. It doesn't take a lot of work. I don't need to dig out. But building on rock sounds to me like a huge amount of work. I need to have certain very powerful equipment to dig into the rock to build. And I think Jesus is saying here there is a real cost about that you talked about, the cost of persecution in certain contexts. But I think there's a cost in all sorts of ways in which, if we're going to build our lives upon, Jesus, who is the rock, and we've got to dig deep into him, that is not always going to be straightforward, simple or quick.
So, Alex, this is our fourth and final discussion on the wonderful subject of being real about discipleship. Now, of course, you've written a book about discipleship, and so we're really drilling into this subject to try to find out something about the cost of discipleship and this need to be consistent witnesses and followers of Jesus. I thought it would be useful just for us to, again, turn back to the Bible.
Sure.
Very short portions. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13 and Luke 14 verses 28 to 30. Yes. So really quite short, but I think they speak very much into the whole subject that we have been exploring. So Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13. I'll just turn to it. I'm reading from the Christian Standard Bible of 2011. And it's headed up here in this translation as believers are salt and light. So verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. So, Alex, what do you think that Jesus is saying here? Losing saltiness. What's the key message? And is this a harsh message?
It's certainly an important message. I think what Jesus is saying here is that God's people, his disciples, should make a difference in the world in which we live. When people live their lives according to the kingdom values, the values Jesus taught, and live their lives led by his Spirit, then people will notice. And it's interesting that the two examples of this is salt and light. Mm-hmm. So we focused on salt in the verse you read, because salt at the time of Jesus is something which clearly adds flavour, and I think Christian living adds flavour to our culture. It's pointing to something spiritual. It's pointing to ultimate truth. It's talking about the things of eternity. So hopefully a Christian community, an individual disciple, individual Christian, adds flavour to the life and others around them. But also salt preserves. It preserves food. It protects. And I think there's a sense in which the Christian community and Christian values helps to hold on to and protects and preserves what's important. Issues around the sanctity of life and the dignity of each human being. These are core biblical values, and as salt of the earth, as Christians, we hope to preserve and protect and to add flavour to the culture we're in. So I think this is what Jesus is saying here. I think for most of us today, the idea of salt losing its saltiness is really very hard, because the salt you and I would use is a pure salt. and it can't really lose its saltiness. But at the time of Jesus, the salt which was made in the desert in the flat water beds of the desert would have been very impure. It would have been mixed in. So you have this stuff called salt, but because there's other crystals in it, it would easily lose its saltiness. So this idea of salt losing its saltiness would have been well known to the people of Jesus' time. And I think he's saying, if as a follower of mine, you become so absorbed in the culture that you don't push against it, or that you don't speak truth to power, if you lose touch with my spirit, then that becomes worthless. Just like this salt which has lost its saltiness. So I think it's a challenging passage.
So Jesus has warned, and therefore there is a danger of which we need to be aware.
Absolutely. And I think particularly in today's culture, I think as Christians we're called to be in the world but not of it. And I think that's really hard to get right. But I think when we get that right, we see that we are being like salt and like light in the world we live in. And if we're too either if we're too remote from the culture, we're too distant from it, we can't be salt and light. But also, if we're so immersed in it that there's nothing different. There's no struggle. There's no counter narrative to our culture.
So the call then rarely is to become a hermit and go away and disappear, because we can't be salty in that sense.
Yeah.
But by the same token, if we take on the flavour of the world in which we're living, this world, as opposed to the kingdom, then the danger is that we essentially lose our ability to shine for Jesus.
Absolutely. And I think, depending on our personalities and our experiences, we're walking this tightrope of being in the world but not of it. In the world is salt and light. And depending on your personality and your experience, the danger is to fall off either side. The kind of hermit approach, I'll just keep myself away, I'll set up a small Christian community which is isolated from the world. I won't engage with culture because I'm basically fearful of it. That could be a response some of us would take. Others of us feel we get absorbed in the culture.
And is that burying our talent?
Well, maybe it is. Maybe it connects back to that out of a kind of fearfulness of engaging with culture because we're going to be overwhelmed by it. But perhaps there's the opposite, where some of us feel confident in the culture we're in and we kind of get married to its values. That perhaps over time you think, gosh, I've lived an effective life according to the values of my culture, but is it really kingdom values? And that's where, again, some of us, all of us, need to give an account.
Well, thank you for that explanation, Alex. That's helpful. Let's turn then to Luke chapter 14. Verses 28 to 30, so just two verses. In this translation, it's headed up, the cost of following Jesus. So verse 28, which of you, wanting to build a tower, doesn't first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, after he has laid the foundation and cannot finish it, all the onlookers will begin to ridicule him, saying, "This man started to build and wasn't able to finish." So again, perhaps you could comment on what it is that Jesus is really highlighting in those few verses.
Yeah, I think, as we said all along in our conversations, there's a cost of following Jesus. And we've got to consider carefully what that means, particularly how we engage with the culture around us and the choices we make. And I think Jesus is saying, just as someone who sets out on a major building project would consider carefully the costs of that and the kind of timeline of that, he's saying that he doesn't want his disciples, he doesn't want you or I to be naive or shallow in our Christian life. We want us to be reflective and faithful and considered in what we're saying. We don't overpromise. We're not naive about what we do. We know there is a cost. So I think this is what Jesus is saying about the tower, that we need to be very careful about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And right at the beginning of our conversation, I think 3 podcasts back, we talked about there's an urgency about the Christian faith, but there's also something to be considered. And here we have in Jesus focusing on the importance of considering carefully.
So everything we said, actually, in a sense, Alex, has been quite Western focused. If I was to become a Christian in Pakistan, India, China, Iran, all sorts of places, I would readily weigh up the cost. I would know instantly that there's a cost to be paid for being a disciple of Jesus. Over here, we're perhaps less focused upon the idea that there is actually a cost.
Yeah, I think the context in which you become a follower of Jesus shapes the cost and the benefits and the opportunities and the struggles you face. I think that's clearly the case, and maybe in some ways, we have a greater freedom here, or which can help us on our journey, but it can also perhaps make us blind to some of the real challenges of discipleship. And I think you're right. But it's interesting that Jesus talks about the cost of building a tower. He also talks about the wise man built his house upon a rock rather than building on sand. I should imagine, I'm not a builder, but I should imagine building on sand, it's quite tempting. It doesn't take a lot of work. I don't need to dig out. But building on rock sounds to me like a huge amount of work. I need to have certain very powerful equipment to dig into the rock to build. And I think Jesus is saying here there is a real cost about that. You talked about the cost of persecution in certain contexts. But I think there's a cost in all sorts of ways in which, if we're going to build our lives upon, Jesus, who is the rock, and we've got to dig deep into him, that is not always going to be straightforward, simple, or quick.
No, not always easy.
No.
Okay, so perhaps then the final question, perhaps to remind ourselves, the good news really is good news for all people, certainly in potential.
Yes.
It is good news offered to all of humankind. If I can receive Jesus today, what does that guarantee for me tomorrow?
Well, we had that wonderful passage in our discussion about eternal life. So when we've become followers of Jesus, we have his presence coming into us today, which gives us assurance that we belong to him forever. So when we become a Christian, we receive the fullness of God's promises to us. And that is good news beyond my ability to explain that to the podcast audience today.
Yes.
It's beyond that. And each Christian will be able to add another layer to why the gospel is good news to all people at all times and in all places. The gospel is good news. But as we've been digging into this, there's also a huge cost. And many, many faithful Christians have paid a huge cost to follow Jesus. And looking in as an outsider, looking in, you think, gosh, that's been really, really difficult. But I think every Christian who's paid that cost, if they had an opportunity to say, would say, I wouldn't want it any other way.
The cost was worth it.
Yeah, that's right. What I was asked to pay pales into insignificance to what Jesus has paid for me.
And indeed the blessings that he brings.
Absolutely. Yeah, both in this life and the things of eternity.
Into eternity.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Alex, for opening up this whole subject. I repeat, there is a link to your book if any of our podcast viewers want to obtain a copy for themselves, plus some other material from the Bible Student, which you are also involved with, freely downloadable. So thank you, Alex. I think that's been really helpful, and I hope our podcast viewers will think carefully about some of the issues that we've been discussing.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.